One of the many things that makes the wildlife watching experience on Explore.org so rich is our ability to see wild animals as individuals and learn about the work and dedication of the people committed to a future with wildlife. The manatee cams are no exception. This winter, we've witnessed rescues, moments of success, and hours of manatees just being manatees. We're going to discuss all of those things and more today. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with Explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And I'm joined to talk about manatees right now by Cora Burcham, the director of multimedia and a manatee research associate for Save the Manatee Club, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting manatees, their aquatic habitat, and aiding in the recovery of manatees throughout the world. Cora, great to speak with you once again. Thanks for joining me for another live chat.
Yeah, absolutely. So glad to be back and talk about manatees tonight.
Yeah, we always have a lot to talk about associated with manatees, and a lot has happened this winter, especially on the cameras. If you have questions for Cora about manatees, then drop those in the comments. We'll be looking for them during the broadcast today. I got a ton of questions for Cora, but I'm going to try to get to some audience questions throughout the broadcast as well. So don't be shy. Let us know what you want to know. And Cora, this winter, you've seen examples of successful manatee rehabilitation, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But first, let's talk about the capture and rescue of some manatees that were in distress. There were two rescues within, I think, 2 days in early February at Blue Springs State Park, and you were there for them. One involved a manatee that had been rescued previously, and the other was a capture of an orphan calf. So let's start there with that orphan calf. Do we know anything about the calf's life prior to when it grabbed the attention of Save the Manatee Club staff?
Yeah, so we don't know exactly where the orphan came from or how it got to Blue Spring. The first time I noticed it was probably in mid-December, and I just noticed that there was a manatee calf with a manatee mother who I knew that wasn't her biological calf because her calf had some little marks on it, so I already knew that wasn't hers. But there were so many calves that I thought, who knows, maybe it's just some random calf hanging out with another mother. Unfortunately, we then saw it hanging out with many different mothers and also trying to nurse from males. And it really seemed like it wasn't bonding with anyone in particular, which then got our attention because that's usually a sign that that calf is orphaned. Now, oftentimes other manatee mothers will adopt orphan calves, so that's really the best scenario when they take care of those calves and we don't have to interfere because the calves, just do really well. Unfortunately, with this calf, like we just saw in the footage, its condition really declined over the weeks, which really got our attention. It was very thin. It was kind of lethargic. You could almost see like the ribs and kind of what we call a peanut head, which is just a kind of a indent behind the neck region. So that was just something that was really concerning to us and our partners.
Yeah, and a little bit of a follow-up to one thing that you said is, manatee calves sometimes are adopted. So can you talk a little bit more about how orphan manatee calves deal with a separation from their mother? How are they looking to survive? They need, I think, guidance, and of course, they need food from a female if they're young enough. So how are they trying to survive if they're put in that circumstance?
Yeah, so orphan calves can really be very opportunistic. Manatees in general, they're very resilient. So usually what we see with orphan calves is that they do try to latch on to different mothers. They may try to stick with one mother. If that mother isn't really in the mood to care, they may actually move on to another mother. So we see that a lot, just the calf kind of opportunistically hopping around and trying to nurse on different adults. And there's very few instances where the manatee calf just like sits there and gives up. They're really trying, but they're very small and they do need that milk from mom, especially during the winter months. They're having a really hard time because they're dealing with the cold weather. They're dealing with large aggregations of manatees, which can be a good thing. There's a lot of mothers out there. But as you see here, that little calf is kind of in the middle of an aggregation and it's just not in good body condition. So it's been trying for weeks to get enough nourishment. But I think a combination between not finding that and dealing with the cold water just eventually led to the point where it wasn't doing that well anymore. It was actually looked pretty good when I first saw it, so that wasn't really a reason for concern back then, but over the weeks the condition really started to decline.
Yeah, so those observations, those daily observations that you do, I think can maybe be really important into diagnosing or evaluating the body condition of individual manatees. So about that orphan, once again, what observations did you see that led to the decision to rescue the calf?
Yeah, so we usually do a lot of observations on any manatees that we're concerned about, whether it's an orphan calf or boat strike or anything like that, because the last thing we want to do is put them through a stressful rescue and, remove them from their natural habitat when they might be able to heal or to survive on their own. We do want to give them that chance. So there are very rare opportunities where we say this animal needs to be rescued right now, here and there. It usually takes days, if not weeks of really careful observation to see how that animal is doing. So with orphan calves, we usually look at behavior, like is it nursing? Is it nursing from the same mom? Is it, associating and sticking with one mom calf pair, or is it hopping around? A sign of trouble is when it's also hanging around with male manatees, trying to nurse from them, which really means it's desperate to find that nourishment, and obviously will not, unfortunately, not get that from a male manatee that's not lactating. So we observe that very closely. We observe body condition. We try to document that, both using our GoPro cameras as well as the webcams. Some of the footage you saw earlier with the manatee swimming by, that was recorded with our webcam, which is amazing, that we have those tools. And then if we do see that we see, a drastic decline in body condition, that's when we and our partners really decide to intervene and try to rescue that animal.
Let's think about the end of the process when the manatee is ready to be returned to the wild. So what criteria is used to determine when an orphan is ready to return to the wild?
So with orphans, they do have to reach a weight of at least 600 pounds. That sounds like a lot. Manatees are usually born at around 60 to 70 pounds. So they do have to reach that weight in order to be independent and be able to kind of fend for themselves out there. That's a guideline by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who is responsible for managing manatees. So that also gives them a little bit of a buffer. So they're a little bit bigger than they would need to be on their own. But oftentimes when you rehabilitate an orphan and you release them back out into the wild, they do take a couple of weeks to really get used to their habitat, to get used to how to feed, how to find that warm water, how to find the food. So you do want to give them a little bit of extra buffer. So even if they lose a bit of weight, they're not at the point where they could no longer sustain themselves. So you want to give them a little bit of that buffer. So it's usually a weight and a size requirement that they have to meet, and that's those 600 pounds. And once they have reached that release weight and they're cleared otherwise, obviously they get an exam by a vet, looking at blood work, looking at those blood values, all of that kind of stuff, making sure there's nothing else going on with their bodies, like abscesses or so on and so forth. And then they will be ready to go back out into the wild.
And that wasn't the only rescue. Like I mentioned before, there was a second rescue at Blue Spring, and this one was a known manatee that had been rescued before. So let's talk about I pronounce it's churro, right? Or am I pronouncing that incorrectly?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. So tell us about churro. Who is she?
So Churro is actually a really special story. Like you said, she just got re-rescued from Blue Spring. That was just the day after you rescued the orphan, as a coincidence. But Churro actually was first rescued in May of 2021 with her mother, Reckless. At the time, Churro was a very small calf. You can see there, that's actually her very first rescue. She was a newborn calf. Actually still had a little bit of the umbilical cord attached to her. So she was extremely small. And she was rescued together with mom because the mom was extremely injured. She had a very severe watercraft injury, and no one really thought that mother manatee was going to survive. It was one of the most horrendous injuries that me and the rescue team have ever seen. So they were brought into rehabilitation to SeaWorld Orlando, and they had a really rough recovery. SeaWorld did an amazing job rehabilitating that mom, and in the process, Churro, grew up with mom in a human setting. So eventually in the January of 2024, so about a year ago, Reckless and Churro were ready to be returned to the wild. So you can see in this picture here, this is Reckless, and this is us returning Reckless and Churro together into the wild, and they were actually released at Port Everglades, which is down in the Miami, Fort Lauderdale area. because that's where Reckless had previously had sightings. So Reckless is the mom, in case I didn't say that. She was
Okay.
the big female, and she was named Reckless. So we released them together, hoping that they would stay together and that Churro would learn from her mother, Reckless, what to do out there, because she was so tiny at her rescue, her initial rescue, that she really didn't have any experience out in the wild whatsoever. They were outfitted with satellite tracking devices, so you can kind of see that in the video over there right now. It's that floating buoy there behind them. So it's a belt that goes around the tail, and then a tether attaches to the satellite tag. So we're both outfitted with those tags to make sure that they were doing okay out there. What happened, unfortunately, was that Churro was really at the size where she would have been weaned from Reckless. So Reckless went right and Churro went left. And Reckless said, well, I'm moving on. And Churro did not stay with Reckless. So the decision was made pretty quickly by our partners that Churro needed to be re-rescued because she was not doing well. She had no idea what she was doing out there, swimming in circles, which is a sign of distress. So the decision was made, since she had not imprinted on any sort of habitat, to actually relocate her to Blue Spring, which was kind of nice for me because that's where I do most of my photo ID work. So having Churro, who I had rescued as a really tiny calf, having her at Blue Spring was really amazing. So we relocated her with our partners to Blue Spring, and she did really well over there during the summer. So she came and went, she found food, she hung out with other manatees. She came back for the winter season looking really good, great body condition. But unfortunately, over the course of the winter, which was really her very first winter out there, she kept losing a lot of weight. She did not go out to feed at all during January, so she almost spent an entire month without eating. She was very carefully monitored by our partners, and eventually the decision was made that she had lost so much weight that we needed to bring her back in for rehabilitation. So as you can see here in this video, you can really see how that's not what a manatee is supposed to look like. She was very thin. You can see some ventral folds there on her. She was also pretty lethargic. So those were all signs that she was not doing too great. So they brought her in, and hopefully she will be able to make a quick recovery and then go back out there.
And can you tell us about the methods that rescuers use to capture Churro and also the orphan? I mean, we had footage of both of those from the webcams. So, manatees aren't small animals, right? I mean, even a calf is a sizable animal. So how do you approach a manatee, corral it, and then haul it in the boat and keep it, reduce the stress on the animal as much as you can?
Yeah, it's definitely a process. So sometimes for small calves, we can use what we call a hoop net. So it's almost like a fishing net where you can kind of just hoop them with. So you can see that here on the boat, the lady and the two ladies in the front, they're actually holding like a big net that they're trying to hoop the calf from the boat. Sometimes that's successful. We've had successful rescues like that, but sometimes it's also really difficult. So for Churro and this orphan calf, we actually had to do what we call a net set. So there's a big net that's in the back of the boat there, and it has float lines on top. Those are the white kind of bobbing buoys that you see up there, and it has a lead line on the bottom. So we basically corral the manatee in that net. And then once the manatee's in the net, we pull the net up onto the boat with the manatee in it. That's obviously easier said than done. They are large animals. Sometimes we capture more than one animal in the net, so we have to make sure that we actually get the other ones that we accidentally caught out of the net in order to get the one that we need in the net. And then we will get it onto the boat. It's a specialized rescue boat that actually has the motor in the front and is open on the back. So that's how we can corral the manatee in the net, then pull the net onto the boat with the manatee, and then transport it over to a nearby boat ramp and get it into the rescue truck. So what's interesting about manatees compared to some other marine mammals, they do not crush under their own weight. So they can actually be on the boat or in a truck if they're placed on really thick foam mats, and they can survive out of the water for pretty much an indefinite time. Obviously, we try to keep them comfortable by spraying them down with water or covering them in a blanket if it's cold in the winter time, but it's kind of a neat adaptation that they do not crush under their own weight, so they're pretty easy to transport once you have them out of the water.
And then you have a role in, or had a role in those rescues as well. In fact, in that last clip, if people were paying attention, they may have noticed a canoe. And you can't boat in Blue Spring in that spot. You have to be a person who has special permission to go in there. So you see that canoe kind of hanging out in the back there. What were you doing that day in assisting in this process?
Yeah, so usually what my role is at Blue Spring, since I know the animals pretty well, especially like for the orphan, for example, I knew which one it was. So obviously we have lots of calves there. I knew which one the orphan was. So I was asked to keep an eye on that orphan until the rescue crew could arrive, which is kind of easier said than done, because if you have hundreds of manatees in a spot and they're all moving around, it's really important that someone does keep eye contact with that animal. They can move around, they can swim around, so it'd be very difficult for the rescue crew to determine which one they need to get. So I was basically keeping an eye on that manatee until the rescue crew got there and, pointed out to them where it was. It actually took several net sets for us to capture that animal. So I was constantly moving around trying to relocate the orphan and getting it into the right spot. And then eventually they more or less took over. That's why you kind of see me hovering in the background, just standing by to see if they need some extra hands or anything to get the animal onto the boat. So that's pretty much my role at Blue Spring, keeping an eye on the manatee and reporting what I see to them. And then when they actually come out to rescue, it's mostly them doing all the muscle work to get the manatee onto the boat, and I help later on trying to get it into the truck.
And about that boat, it's a special design. It's not like your typical boat. So how does the boat's design aid in the rescue of manatees?
Yeah, the boat is very special in a way that it is open in the back. So you basically just have like a place that you open it, and you can then get the net out of it and you can pull the animal onto the boat. So it's very different than other boats because you can literally remove the back and get the animal on there. So you just have this entire back end of the boat is like a platform where you can get the manatee onto. And then the motor for the boat is actually in the front, and then you have the driver of the boat kind of on top. So it aids with, visual ability to actually see the manatee if you're up on top of that boat looking down. So it's a very specialized rescue boat. They're really specially made for manatees. And obviously, usually no motorboats are allowed in Blue Spring during the winter time. So if you do see a boat on the camera, on the webcam, that's most likely the rescue boat that will come in there. We try to avoid having to bring it in there, but obviously if we have to do a rescue, we have to bring that big boat in there.
And the webcams are part of this process as well. We have the ability to see underwater, get a really great look at manatees, and from the above water cam, get a general sense of how many manatees are in the area. So how were the webcams of use to you when you were thinking about whether to rescue those manatees?
Yeah, those webcams are amazing. They do provide a really great entertainment and educational tool for the public, but they also really help us with our research. So, since they are stationary and they don't interfere with the manatee's natural behavior, they're kind of our eyes and ears out in the spring, because manatees will literally just swim by the webcam and we can assess body condition. With the above water camera, we have been able to monitor manatees, for example, orphans. We've seen them going around between different mothers and nursing. Here you'll see the little orphan that we rescued actually going by the underwater camera. So it's a very good way to monitor their behavior or their body condition without actually having to get close to the animals, without having to get into the water to get photos or getting, those observations, which can really stress them out if they're already in a non-ideal condition. So having those webcams out, they're kind of doing that work for us. It's amazing, especially because they can passively do it without disturbing the manatee. That orphan had no idea that it was being monitored at the time that it was swimming by the camera. So that's a really neat way for those webcams to help us, and they've helped us in numerous rescues. So this was not the first time, it's really amazing.
And there's not much that our sharp-eyed camera audience misses. So they often see things, of course, that I don't, even when I'm watching the same cameras as them. And if you have questions, again, for Cora Bertram with the Save the Manatee Club, drop those in the comments. I know there's one question in there already that we've gotten. It's a really good one. I'm going to save it to the end because it has to do with the question that I have lined up for Cora a little bit later on in the broadcast. But send us more questions if you have them. Cora, I do want to talk about a a manatee that is a success story. This is a formerly orphaned manatee whose story I think does illustrate the chances of success for rescued manatees. And this one is nicknamed Tink Tink. So what's Tink Tink's backstory?
Yeah, so Ting Ting was actually also a Blue Spring Manatee, and she was an orphan as well. That was back in December of 2021 that we captured her, and she was actually one of the ones that was hoop netted from the canoe. We had monitored her again for a couple of weeks, and it was both in person as well as on the webcams. She was very thin, as you can see here in that picture we just saw. She had those ventral folds, and here she is on the webcam. It's a little hard to see with the sun, but you can see there's a really tiny manatee there in the front swimming, and it's kind of being followed by a couple of adults. It was trying to nurse off of them, but they were not really in favor of that, so they were actually chasing her around, and we observed that in more than one instance, which really helped us to let our partners at FWC know that this was indeed an orphan and it wasn't just a small calf that was swimming around. It was really trying to approach different females and try to nurse from them, and it didn't work. So having that webcam footage and showing it to them really led to the decision to rescue that animal, and she was successfully rescued. Here again, we see that mother manatee trying to chase her around and not letting her nurse. So luckily she was successfully rescued, and again she went to SeaWorld Orlando first for initial rehab, and then she was transferred to our partners at the Georgia Aquarium. They're a second stage rehab facility for manatees. So Ting Ting was actually one of the first manatees that they took in and successfully rehabilitated. And then she was brought back to SeaWorld for pre-release conditioning and was released last year in February at Blue Spring, and she was outfitted with a satellite tracking device, like all the orphans that are going out. So she could be monitored by our partners for the first year of her life to make sure that she is doing okay. And here she's going by the webcam. I think that was just a couple of days or maybe even the day of her release. You can see how she's wearing that satellite tracking device there. And she was monitored for about a year, and she did everything that we were hoping she would do. She went out to feed, she came back in for the cold weather, for the warm water. So her tracking gear was recently removed. I think it was just maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. So she basically graduated from the program, and she is now a wild manatee, so like everyone else. And it's a real success story because she was a tiny orphan at rescue, and now she's out there and completed her monitoring period and is just like everyone else.
And I want to know more about the tracking devices that are attached to many manatees after they've been released. How do those devices work? You mentioned that it's a satellite tracking device.
Yes, so the way that they are designed is there is a belt that goes around what we call the peduncle area. That is where the tail meets the body. It's a good thing to keep in mind for trivia. What is that called? It's a peduncle. And around the belt goes around, and then there is a 3 to 4 foot long tether that attaches to the satellite tag. So you can see that really nicely in the picture there. It's the tether that attaches to the tag. And the tag has all kinds of things in it, like information on temperature, information on diving behavior, a GPS, and it will transmit the manatee's location via satellite to the researcher's computer. So they can actually look at the computer at home and see where the manatee is. So they'll know if it is at a warm water site, they know if it's in an area that has good food sources, all those kind of things. We get a lot of questions about these tracking devices because they look kind of cumbersome, but they actually have 3 weak links in both the belt, the tether, and the tag. So if the manatee gets caught on something or gets, stuck on something, it will just have to pull, and then the whole thing will come off. And it does happen. So this is designed in a way where it doesn't interfere with the manatee's natural behavior. They can travel with that, they can, give birth, they can mate, they can do anything they want. The device is also going underwater with them, so it doesn't hinder them in their natural behavior, but it's really their lifeline for their very first year that they're out there in the wild. If they completely lose that tracking device, or it gets removed by somebody who's thinking that it's an entanglement and they cut it off, which unfortunately has happened, that manatee can no longer be monitored. So come the next winter, we won't know where that manatee is. If it still has that satellite tag and it's in a location where we know there's no warm water anywhere nearby, there is a way for us and our partners to go out and intervene and relocate that manatee to a warm water site. So it's extremely important for them to be monitored for that first year of their life. And if you see a tag manatee, you can report that to local stranding networks or the FWC here in Florida. We always like to know where they are in case there's some malfunctioning with the tag. They also get visual observations a couple of times a week. So the researchers will go out and see what are they doing? Are they with other manatees? All those kind of things. So that's pretty much how the satellite tags work on them.
And obviously they're able to locate the manatees by the tags. But what other? I think you said that there's other information that you can gain from the tags, like about diving behavior, for instance, water temperatures. Yeah. So what all can those tags gather and record?
Yeah, I mean, they also give information about exactly where the manatee is traveling. For example, some manatees are outfitted with these tracking devices to study habitats, so you'll know what routes they use to get from point A to point B. Like I said, they also record like depth, they record the temperatures, so you kind of know like what water temperature the manatee is in, so all those kind of things. The most important thing really is location, so that you know where the manatees are. Another thing that I guess I didn't mention earlier is the belt that goes around them. When they're in fresh water, that also has a VHF signal on them. So if they do lose the actual tag and the tether, researchers might be able to relocate them by the VHF signal that they have in the belt. They have to be pretty close, but if you know what general area the manatee is in, there's also a way with their equipment to be able to locate the manatee just by the belt, which is another way to to potentially relocate it and put another tag on it if it loses the initial satellite tag.
Tink Tink's tracking device was removed recently. So how was that decision made? Is it a certain period of time that they're just the battery life is limited, obviously. So is there just a period of time, or is maybe there the health of the animal is taken into consideration? What are the things that go into that decision?
Yeah, so it's definitely what goes into that consideration is definitely the health of the animal. So first of all, they have to come back to a warm water site the following winter, which most of them are able to do. Most of them manage to come back. So that's kind of the number one thing. And then they have to make it through the winter. So they really have to maintain that good body condition throughout the winter. Most of them will lose some weight during the winter. It's their first winter out in the wild. They need to figure out how to still go out and feed, although the river is a little bit colder than what they would like it to be. So they really have to maintain that body condition over the course of the winter. So researchers look at their body condition, they look at their behavior, and then if they meet all of those check marks, then they decide to remove the gear. Now, if a manatee for some reason, the tag stops working and they get lost somewhere and we're unable to track them, it is designed in a way where the screws or the connectors erode after some time, so the tag will come off. So in case that the researchers would not be able to relocate it and cut it off, it would fall off by itself. So again, no chance that the manatee may, get injured or get caught on something because we're not able to remove it. But usually the tag for about a year, and after that year, they will get the equipment removed. They might do some tag exchanges actually throughout the year because the batteries will not last for an entire year. So they will do some routine tag exchanges throughout the year. But after that 1 year monitoring period, if they do everything that they are supposed to do, like Ting Ting did, her equipment will be removed and then she is a free agent, so to speak.
And we were talking before the program about the weather that you've been experiencing in that area, up and down and up and down and up and down. And so when you're going to release a rehabilitated manatee into the wild, manatees are cold sensitive. So how closely do you monitor the weather when you plan to release a manatee from rehabilitation? And what sort of advantages could it give the manatee if you release them sort of in the right time?
Yeah, so especially for these, what we call naive orphans, which would be the orphan that we just rescued as well as Ting Ting, it might sound counterintuitive, but we actually release them at the end of the winter in a cold front. So the colder it is, the better time to release that manatee, because we release it into a warm water aggregation site with hundreds of other manatees around, hoping that it will follow them and adapt their behavior and kind of learn how to be a wild manatee. We can teach them a lot of things in a human setting, But one thing we cannot teach them is how to find warm water and like what's the difference between warm water and cold water. So what we try to do is release them on a cold winter day into a warm water aggregation where they have company of other manatees, and then they learn this is the warm water and out there's the cold water, and I need to come in here for the warm water. So that's what we're usually trying to do. This year, we got very surprised that it got very warm very quickly at the beginning of February. So we alongside not just us, but like our partners from the Manatee Rescue and Rehabilitation Partnership, they monitor the weather extremely closely. They look at all the cold fronts, they look at all the warm spells to try to figure out like the exact time when is a good time to release these manatees. That really goes for the orphan calves that were rescued as orphans. If there's a manatee that's rescued for, say, an entanglement or a boat strike, they can really go out any time of the year, especially if they're adults. They will know what to do. But for these orphans, we really have to be on top of it and like really look at the weather, which is, as probably everyone can imagine, that's not an easy job because it's hard to predict nowadays. Things go up and down and up and down. So it's always a little bit of a gamble, but we usually try to release them in like early February.
And speaking of the weather, we had an audience question I think is a good follow-up to the one I just asked you. Somebody wrote in at the beginning of our broadcast and was wondering, are there sufficient warm waters to which manatees can escape when cold weather hits?
Yes, so manatees do have to find these warm water sites, and they're usually either way warm water springs or the outflow of power plants. And manatees are very site specific. They usually migrate back to the same warm water sites year after year. So they're usually able to find these warm water sites. Obviously, with power plants going offline in the foreseeable future, it's a huge challenge to transition those manatees that are used to winter at those sites off to other warm water sites. There's always manatees that either way are inexperienced or they're just too far away from a warm water site. Especially with changing climate, they may have migrated way further out than they should have at that time of year. So they're having a hard time getting back to these warm water sites in time and end up with cold stress syndrome. But usually there are enough warm water sites for them if they can get there in time. But obviously, if we have a very warm, say October or very warm November, and then suddenly, bang, it gets cold, they need to really rush to get to these warm water sites. And that can be a challenge for them, especially if they're a little bit further away from them.
And we have some more audience questions to get to in a little bit. We'll have some time for that in a few minutes. So please drop those in the comments if you're looking to ask Cora questions about manatees. I want to change topics, Cora, because manatees are like all organisms on Earth. They have, we are only really scratching the surface about what we know about them. And late last year, there was an interesting paper that was published. It was called "The Historical Ecology Reveals the Surprising Direction and Extent of Shifting Baselines for the Florida Manatee." So it's kind of a mouthful, but to summarize it, I read the paper. The authors examined archaeological and written records for information about manatees in Florida. They concluded that manatees were rare or sometimes absent in parts of Florida for hundreds of years prior to the 1900s. Save the Manatee Club, looked at that paper as well, and they're like, and I know like you and others were kind of scratching your heads at that on some of the paper's conclusions. So what do we know about like the arrival and presence of manatees in North America going back into the past? It's a very complicated story with a lot of different pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, it is a complicated story, so I'm trying to touch on some of the highlights that we know. And the paper definitely had some interesting perspectives. They were looking at literature and archaeological evidence of manatees. That's obviously one way to look at it. There's many different ways to look at things. So I think it's really important to kind of consider different ways to look at this. If you're looking at the fossil and the genetic records of manatees, you'll actually see that some of their ancestors go back hundreds, if not millions of years. So 125,000 years ago, during the glacial, interglacial periods, we had manatees back what used to be that type of manatee back in the day, actually in North Carolina. Now, they did not survive all these glacial periods that came afterwards, so they went extinct at that point, but they were kind of the start of what we see now as the modern manatee. So our manatees that we see right now, if you're looking at the fossil and the genetic record, they actually came from Mexico and the Caribbean about 12,000 years ago. So they first arrived in the Southwest Florida area. You're looking at that, that's kind of the founding population of the Florida manatee. If you're looking at genetic diversity, you'll see that there's more genetic diversity in manatees in that area than there is in other areas of Florida. So due to like currents and thermal barriers, they were unable to go back and forth between Florida and the Caribbean, so they kind of became their isolated population, starting the manatees in Florida. So that was about 12,000 years ago. If you're looking, which is what the authors did, if you're looking at written literature, for example, one thing you need to question is that if like early explorers talked about manatees or wrote about manatees, they may not necessarily have known what they were seeing. So if you're not seeing like a written record of a manatee, they may have called it a seal or a walrus or a dolphin because they just didn't know exactly what they were seeing. They had never seen something like a manatee before. If you're looking at archaeological records, what the authors really did is they're looking at historical exploitation of manatees. Now, if there is not evidence of something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's absent. One of the things that our director of conservation kind of made an analogy, which I think is kind of fitting here, seeing the stars in the sky during the daytime. If I'm looking during the daytime, I'm not seeing the stars. That doesn't mean they're not there. So it's kind of like, a catch-22. If you're looking at archaeological records, you're really looking at were manatees hunted at the time. Now, they may have been hunted at the time, but a carcass of such a very large animal may not have been brought back to where people were settling and where we see these mounds with, historical artifacts. So there's a good chance that those manatees were hunted, but they're not necessarily brought back to where you would be looking for them. Another thing, kind of to wrap up this first question, is if you're looking, for example, at African manatees or manatees in the Amazon, they're very nocturnal. They are pretty active at night due to hunting pressure. So not seeing a manatee or not mentioning it in the literature could literally be, it could be traced back to the fact that they were not really visible because they were hunted, so they were not as visible as they would be visible to us today. So just a lot of things to consider before really coming to a conclusion whether they were absent or present. The authors are saying that they were not really seen in Florida before the 1950s. Now, if you're looking at the Great Depression and manatees were maybe hunted back then, I really doubt that there would be a written record or publication about manatees being hunted because they were already a protected and listed species. So finding, literature or publication about hunting of manatees back then is probably pretty unlikely as well.
And at the end of the last ice age, it was definitely a time of tremendous climate fluctuation. So how might that have affected, if you think about going back 12,000 years up until now, how might those climate fluctuations influenced manatee populations in the southeastern part of North America?
I mean, manatee populations would have definitely shifted due to, these glacier periods or just a shift in climate. Since manatees are a subtropical species, they would have not been living in that cold water. Now, they may have had a very different distribution back then anyway. It's kind of difficult to compare these historic baselines and like trying to figure out how manatees use habitat. Just as an example, if you're looking at the Everglades, back in the day, that was a huge area full of water and a swampy area what manatees could have definitely lived in. Now, if you're looking at the Everglades today, there's still some manatees, but they're using that habitat very differently. So trying to compare how many manatees were using that same habitat in different areas is just very difficult.
The popular media's reaction to the paper often wasn't helpful either. In fact, one press release was titled, "Why Manatees Are Likely Not Florida Natives," which wasn't even something that the paper had claimed. So what was your reaction upon reading headlines like that suggested manatees aren't native to Florida or are just recent arrivals?
Yeah, so that was actually something that the authors of this paper never even stated that they weren't native. So the problem with that is if you're calling something non-native, I'm so sorry.
That's
Um,
okay.
a lot of times people will kind of question, well, if it's not native, why do we need to protect it? Well, I think that's the last thing that we want to think about, when we're thinking about manatees, because they certainly need these protections. And I don't think that's something the authors were even trying to get out there, that manatees are not native and they don't need our protection. So that's just something that kind of the media, in the way it was displayed, um, it kind of gave a little bit of the wrong vibe to a lot of people thinking, well, if they're not native to Florida, why do we even have to care? Why do we have to protect them if they're recent arrivals to Florida? So that's kind of where that came from.
Yeah, and saying manatees aren't native to Florida is like saying spruce trees aren't native to where I live in Maine, because the area where I live was once covered completely by ice and there were no trees. If you go back 20,000 years, Maine is completely covered by ice. So none of the trees here would be native under those definitions. So I think, non-human organisms, we should just respect them for what they're able to do and their own agency. It's not necessarily, a decision that we should be making about who this it gets to live where. And then setting aside the paper's conclusions, Cora, I think this really gives us an opportunity to consider why we place value on non-human organisms and how that and maybe how we can apply historic baselines to conservation efforts. It's important to know how ecosystems and wildlife populations function, of course, but manatees are experiencing different threats now. So why do manatees need ongoing protections?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a good question too, because manatees face, a whole variety of threats, from boat strikes to entanglements to habitat loss. So there's just so many things that these guys are dealing with. A lot of things that historically they may not have to deal with. We didn't have as many boats. Our Florida population is increasing by the day, and everyone wants to live by the water or by the coast. So just like the amount of pressure that's going onto their habitat, that they have lived in for hundreds of years, millions of years, is obviously a threat to them. So it's just really important to look at all of those threats and, realize that they're still there and that they need those protections, especially as we are, encroaching on their habitat, whether that's through building more marinas, having more developments, these artificial warm water sites retiring and trying to wean those manatees off to natural warm water sites. So all of those are things to, keep in mind. And those threats are unfortunately not necessarily decreasing, but with, seeing an increase in a lot of them. So just something to keep in mind as well.
And yeah, we had an audience question that is related to this as well. Somebody wrote in and said, "Thank you for your work. Manatees need all the help and protection they can get. Is there any way to increase protections, especially from boat strikes? Any chance of implementing prop guard requirements?"
Yeah, so that is a good question. I think there's always ways to increase protections, whether that's through slow speed zones, whether that's through education, sanctuaries for them where they can rest undisturbed in the wintertime, especially. Prop guards are definitely a good first step in the right direction. We do get that question a lot, so I personally wish that prop guards would be mandatory, but however, they really need to be used with caution as well, because what we do need to keep in mind that a very large percentage of manatee watercraft fatalities are actually not caused by the propellers, but they're caused by the impact of a fast speeding boat. So whether that's a jet ski or a small power boat or a very large power boat, it's really that impact that's causing a lot of these fatalities. So going slow in manatee habitat is really the number one thing that boaters can do to protect manatees. And that combined with prop guards really would be sort of the solution. But the prop guard alone may prevent certain injuries, but it's certainly not kind of a fix for all. So if you are having a prop guard or if they're mandatory, it's just really important to understand that in the context of how they're used and not thinking, oh, well, now I have a prop guard, my boat is no longer a problem, so I can speed through here like there's no tomorrow because my prop guard is going to protect the manatees. So it's just a really important thing to keep in mind, but it's a good first step in the right direction.
I also noticed too when I was looking at the footage of the rescue boat that it wasn't a propeller based prop. It was a jet propulsion um, engine as well, and those could be maybe better a step in the right direction. But yeah, just to reiterate what you said, the actual striking of the Manatee of the boat hull itself can be just a disaster for them. So please, yes, slow down.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also sometimes it was really difficult for me to kind of understand this concept in the beginning, but usually what you see is these horrific wounds that are usually from the props. But if you're looking at the fatalities, oftentimes on the outside, you can't even really see what caused that fatality. Is sometimes there's not even anything visible, but then if you look at the inside of the manatee, you may see, broken bones or punctured lungs or something which can happen from that impact of a fast speeding boat. So obviously for poor Reckless here, that was definitely a prop, and I wish for her that prop guards would be mandatory, but at the same time, a lot of these fatalities are happening by the impact of a fast speeding boat, and on the outside, there's not even any sort of visible trauma. And then if you were to look on the inside, you would find, what actually caused that fatality.
Yeah, and just looking at the manatees and what they're able to heal from, it's really remarkable. Looking at those photos of Reckless and the trauma that she experienced, and she was able to survive. So don't give up on manatees, people. They seem like they're a lot tougher than they look, I suspect.
Absolutely.
One final audience question that came in earlier. Somebody was wondering about something that you said, Cora, because you mentioned that you can look at a manatee and kind of tell whether its body shape is whether it's well fed or if it's in distress. So this person asked, if a manatee is seen with folds that you mentioned, should they be reported? Is this a clear indication they are underfed?
Usually, if you see a manatee that has ventral folds like that, that is definitely an indication that something is wrong with that animal. So whether that's, from like a starvation event where they cannot find enough food sources, or it could also be that they have ingested something such as, a fishing line or any sort of trash that got stuck in their intestines and they're unable to feed or digest their food. That can cause that as well. In Shuro's case, again, she didn't really go out to feed, so she lost a lot of weight. The orphan also didn't get the nutrition that it needs. Seeing those ventral folds is sometimes, difficult if you are on land and you're seeing a manatee from up above. Even from us on the canoe, sometimes we usually see their backs and their tails. So we don't really see what's underneath. And especially with Churro here, our co-researchers who are monitoring the tag manatees, they were actually the ones who got really, really concerned because they're able to get photos in the water on the underside and with our webcams, and they were really seeing those ventral folds and saying, oh, that does not look good at all. From up above, it was really difficult to see that. So we don't necessarily always expect people to see those ventral folds, but if you do see them, that is usually an indication that something is wrong with that animal, alongside some other signs as well. If they're, that underfed, they're usually pretty lethargic. They may hang out in kind of the same area. They may not move around a lot. Sometimes you see sort of a heavy algae mat on them. You saw that on Churro. You saw that she kind of looked a little bit brown. Same thing here on the orphan. You see that there's quite a bit of algae growing on that orphan, which again, algae by itself is not necessarily like a number one indication that something is wrong, but that together with that lethargic behavior and like a skinny appearance, can definitely pinpoint to the fact that something is going on there. Sometimes we see what we call a peanut head, and that's kind of that indent behind the head, like kind of in the neck region. You really want a manatee to be filled out and kind of fat, not fat looking, but they do have some, and they have a little bit of, fat over there. You don't want that head to kind of stick out like a peanut. So that's another indication as well, alongside with these ventral folds that the person asked about.
And when they're cold stressed too, they sometimes show some behaviors that indicate that they might be in distress, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. With the cold stress, that's what we see a lot of times in the winter time when they don't find a warm water site in time. So cold stress really displays itself in a bunch of different ways. So again, they might be lethargic, they may not be moving around a whole lot, they might be skinny in appearance. They may also have white lesions on their body, not to be confused with barnacles. If you see a manatee in a saltwater environment, they sometimes do grow these little barnacles on them that are also little white dots. But the cold stress lesions, we usually see them especially around the head region, around the pecs, the flippers, as well as around the tail. So, and again, in the winter time, again, that's usually alongside lethargic behavior and just a skin, like an overall skinny appearance as well. So we had a cold stress rescue at Blue Spring in, I think it was in December. Luckily, we got him in time, and I think he's almost ready for release. So another release coming up, hopefully. But yes, we do see that pretty much every winter as well, that we have some cold stressed animals.
Well, thanks to our audience for sending in those questions. I do have one final question for you, Cora. Manatees, I think, enrich the lives of many, many people, and they're valuable just because they're organisms on this earth and they have a right to exist. But I'm wondering, what does the presence of manatees in Florida mean for you personally?
I mean, I think they're just these really amazing, majestic animals. Like you said before, they are so resilient. Some of the things that we have seen them recovering from are just absolutely amazing. I think they're just like a really eye-opening animal. They're not as well known as some other animals. So people come here to see them. They are the state marine mammal for Florida. That's obviously already something important. But, our tourism lives off of those manatees too. There's, hundreds and thousands of people who come to Florida to see the manatees. So I think for me, they're just like really a symbol of what makes Florida special. I did not know what a manatee was until about 13 years ago when I discovered there is such a thing called a manatee. So I would have never thought I would move to Florida or work in Florida, and now I do with manatees, and it's because of the manatees. And I think they're just like a really essential part of our ecosystem and part of our state, and they just deserve those protections just because of that, really. They're just like a really integral part of our whole ecosystem. And again, people come here to see them. So a lot of our tourism dollars come from those manatees and those ecotourism as well. So I guess that's another point to make.
Well, yeah, I hope everyone could take a little bit of inspiration from Cora and find your animal or animals or plants or whatever they happen to be, because it's a endless source of fascination, and it can really bring a lot of richness to our own lives as people. Well, Cora, I want to thank you for joining me on the program today. I always learn a ton from you about manatees, and it's been fun to have this conversation.
Yeah, it was awesome to be here, and always happy to talk about manatees, and hopefully we'll see a few more on the webcams over the next couple of days, because we're supposed to get another little cold front. So I'm hoping that there will be some nice action for our viewers on the webcams coming up.
Absolutely. It's something that I'm looking forward to as well. And I want to thank my guest today for joining me, Cora Burcham, the Director of Multimedia and a Manatee Research Associate for Save the Manatee Club. If you do want to look for those manatees coming up on the webcams, you can go there anytime. You can go to manateev.org or explore.org/manatee. And of course, if you want to learn about manatees, probably the best place on the internet to do that directly is savethemanatee.org. And my name is Mike Fitz with Explorer.org. Thanks for joining me today. And until we talk to you again, never stop learning.